All right, welcome back to another lesson. This time we will be continuing on with Basic Connecting Words Part 2. So last week we discussed Part 1, and this is still part of the series of lessons on sentence construction. So this is not the last time we'll be talking about sentence construction. In fact, we might be talking about it the whole term. All right. So, what are we going to talk about today? So, we're going to look at the specific connecting words that we haven't discussed yet and your assignment. So, what are the connecting words we'll be looking at? We've got two. One is for time and the other is for conditions. Let's get started with time. So for time, again, this is not exhaustive. This lesson is not exhaustive. It's not a complete time conjunctions lesson, but this kind of lays the foundation so that you can go up or go forward to the other lessons on time conjunctions. So if you've got six, when, as soon as, before, after, until, and while. So I know you're very familiar with these. Now we are going to talk about these in a deeper way so that we can master them. Let's look at the first one. I used to play tennis a lot when I was a teenager. So I don't need to explain this. This is the most common time conjunction, right? The second one is as soon as. She went back to Hong Kong as soon as she finished her studies. Now, you might be asking at this point, what's the difference between when and as soon as? When do we use as soon as? Well, it's almost the same with when, but it has an emphasis on immediately, immediately after one action happened, the other action happened. So in this case, she went back to Hong Kong when? As soon as she finished her studies. Let's say she finished her studies yesterday. So if we want to use as soon as, the meaning would be she went back to Hong Kong the same day she finished her studies. Yeah, so that's the meaning of as soon as. It's like immediately after. Okay. The third one you're also familiar with. Make sure you drop by my house before you go home. And the fourth one is after. We had a wonderful dinner after she had arrived. Now, I've been talking about this pattern right here. Yeah, we'll talk more about it, but you can see that it's in past perfect form. Why did we have to use that? I'll explain later. And we also have until. The workers continued the strike until the management agreed to give them a pay raise. Now, when do we use until? Yes, so a lot of English learners are confused with it. And I can see some of you are using it correctly, and I'm happy about that. So when do we use until? Well, this means up to this time. So the workers continue the strike, okay, until up to the time the management agreed to give them a pay raise. That means this is no longer true when the management agreed to give them a pay raise. Okay, this action right here, the first one, stopped when the management agreed to give them a pay raise. Otherwise, it continued. It continued. So that is the meaning of until. You want to say when the action will stop. That's when you use until. Okay, let's move on to the last one. This is very familiar to you, I believe, because we've talked about this already. While I was walking, a rat ran in front of me. So, again, this is for longer action. You can see there was walking because while is for a period of time, no matter how short. And then you pair it up with a short action. Of course, you can do it with long actions. It's up to you. Okay. So I hope that was clear enough. My goal for talking about these is for you to understand the differences between or among these conjunctions. Okay? Now, let's look at some things that we can learn from these examples. Did you notice that your tenses should be consistent? Look at this one. I used to play tennis. So you're talking about the past, right? When I was a teenager. So past tense, past tense. Okay? As soon as she went back, past tense. She finished, past tense also. Make sure you drop by my house before you go home. Okay, now what tense is make? In this case, in this sentence. Well, yes, this is present tense, but in this case, it's a command. What's your clue? Because you have no subject here. That's the usual pattern for a command or a request. Make sure you drop by my house. You make sure. Okay, so this is, when you say command, it's the future, right? Even if it's just a few seconds from now, it's still the future. If your mother tells you, clean your room right now, of course, it's a few seconds from that time she said it. So it's future. Now, let's look at the other part of the sentence. Before you go home. Before you go home. So this is also future. So you can see how consistent their tenses are. This is future as well. Now, if this is future, why don't we use will? Before you will go home. Okay? Did you notice that? Well, let me give you a subtle rule. It's not a very obvious rule. I think many grammar books don't talk about this. But don't use will. Okay, sorry, just focus on this one. Don't use will after time conjunctions. So in this case, you're using before, right? And you are talking about the future. So don't use will. Just use simple present. Okay? So that is the subtle rule. Whenever you use any of these time conjunctions and you're talking about the future, in that part of the sentence, you don't use will. Okay? Next, we had a wonderful dinner. So past tense. After she had arrived. Also past tense. Now, why did we use had arrived? We've talked about this many times in the class. The rule is, if you have two actions in the past, and one action happened before the other, use past perfect. Just like this. Had arrived. Yes, so that means this action had happened first before this action. Next, the workers continue the strike, okay, past tense, until the management agreed to give them a pay raise. So this is all in the past. While I was walking, a rat ran in front of me. Ran is the past tense of run. Okay, so make sure that your tenses are consistent. And of course, there is another thing I want to point out that I did not include here. Look at the punctuation. So if you are using the time conjunctions in the second part of the sentence, in the middle of the sentence, then you don't need to use a comma. Just like because. You don't need a comma, but if you are using it in the first part of the sentence, just like this example while I was walking, then you need a comma. Because this is the main part of your sentence. Okay, so let's move on to expressing conditions. So this is the last category we'll be talking about. So for conditions, we have for, if, unless, in case, as long as. Again, let me remind you that this is not exhaustive. There are other conjunctions we use for conditions. But for the sake of simplicity, I want us to focus on these because they are foundational. They are foundational. If you can't use them well, then we cannot go to the more advanced stuff. So we first have to master the foundation or the basics. Okay, let's look at the examples. The most common one, just like when, is if. If Mr. Johnson cannot raise enough money, he will not buy the house. Okay, so there is the condition clause right here. Did you notice there's also a subject and a verb, and it comes at the beginning of the sentence? That's why we need to use a comma. If it comes in the other part of the sentence or in the middle of the sentence, then you can just drop the comma. I don't need to explain the meaning of this word, this conjunction, because you know it very well, I'm pretty sure. So let's move on to the second one, which is unless. They won't come next week unless you ask them to do so. Okay, I think this one I need to explain a little bit, especially when I look at your writing, because I can see that some of you are confused with unless. When do we use unless? Okay, here is a difference between if. So if is going to be our reference here because it's the most common conjunction for condition. Unless simply means if not. Okay, look at these examples, huh? So basically it's the same thing. They won't come next week unless you ask them to do so. Now, the meaning of this is they won't come next week if you do not ask them to do so. So it's the same sentence. I mean, they have the same exact meaning, but we are using different conjunctions for each of them. So if you want to use unless, then you don't use negative here. If you want to use if, then you can use negative. Yeah, that's the equivalent of it. Unless means if not. Okay? Is that clear? I hope it is. Okay, moving on. In case he isn't available, we'll look for another wedding singer. Now, this is something we're very familiar with because we always see it. But are we also familiar with the meaning? What is the meaning of in case and how is it different from if? Okay, now let's try to analyze this example. In case he isn't available, we look for another wedding singer. So the context is there's a possibility that the wedding singer you hired may not be available. Okay, so what are you gonna do? Now look at these examples. Yeah, the same example basically, but there is the equivalent if. If it isn't available, we look for another wedding singer. Now, I want to illustrate this by using these flowcharts. Okay, so for if, we have two possibilities, right? So one is he is not available, and that is the sentence we have here. If he is not available, what's going to happen? Well, we'll look for another singer. Okay? And there is the other possibility. If he is available, then we won't look for another wedding singer. Okay? So only if this condition is satisfied will we look for another wedding singer. Do you get it? If this condition is not satisfied, that means he is available, then there is no need to look for another singer. Okay, now this is where in case and if becomes different. Very different. Both of them are conditions, yes, but they have very subtle differences or difference. When it comes to in case, look at this. So we have, yes, still two possibilities. He is available or he is not available. But here is the thing. When it comes to in case, whether he is available or not, we'll look for another wedding singer. That's why we say in case is more like a precaution more than a condition. It's not really a condition like if, because whatever happens, we'll look for another singer, whether he is available or not. Okay, so it's more like a precaution, like, okay, we have to be sure, we cannot be sorry in the end. We better be safe than sorry. Something like that. So that is what we use in case for. Okay, do you get the difference? Well, let's go back. All right, the third one or the fourth one is as long as. As long as. You also are seeing this quite often. As long as the entrance fee is free, I will keep coming. I will keep coming. Now, again, let's reference it to if. What's the difference between if and as long as? Okay, now if you say if the entrance fee is free, I will come. If not, I will not come. It's as simple as that, right? Well, as long as it's not so different, but it has a different emphasis because we use it to talk about a condition over a period of time. Okay, look at the original example. As long as the entrance is free, I will keep coming. So if this condition stops to be true, then the other part of the sentence will also not be true. Okay? And there is the emphasis of a period of time. A period of time. Okay? So it's almost the same, but if you look at the negatives of these sentences, you can see that the focus or the emphasis becomes different. Okay, so I guess that's it for our lesson. It's a short one because we only needed to cover 2. Now let's go to your assignment. Actually, it's very simple. It's the same thing that you did last time. So you're going to be doing the same thing. I want you to do the sentence structure exercise for connecting words part 2. Now you can find that under writing exercises section. Now I want you to do this because this is my test, right? This is your test and at the same time my test if you understood the lesson. So show it. I want you to show me how well you understood the lesson by doing this simple exercise. By the way, I noticed that some of you still haven't finished the previous exercise. So please work on it as well. All right, see you in the class.